Hi, everyone. Lisa and I are delighted to be here today. We'd like to thank Dr. Exeter, Arena, and Purdue's Learning, Design, and Technology Department for this chance to share our learning and performance support LEAPS model of instructional design with you. We envision this presentation as more a conversation among friends who are talking shop than a traditional lecture. If you have questions, please either type them into the chat or unmute yourself and ask. First, we'd like to introduce ourselves. Lisa?
Hi, I'm an associate professor of organizational performance and workplace learning at the College of Engineering at Boise State University. I have worked as an instructional designer, a manager at nonprofit organizations, for-profit organizations, non-governmental organizations, the U.S. Department of Defense. And these organizations have ranged in size from a two-person startup through multinational organizational scale. And I continue to serve as an external consultant as well. Thanks so much. Back to you, Steve.
I'm a retired professor of organizational performance and workplace learning. Lisa and I used to have offices next door to each other. I'm now part of Boise State's Process Management Lab. We are retired professors and industry folks, graduate students and graduates, and we help nonprofit organizations grow their capacity to serve their missions and community by improving their internal processes. As a professor, I taught courses in ID and needs assessment, as has Lisa. Before I joined Boise State in 2007, I'd been a performance consultant for almost 20 years. I completed projects for high-tech companies, national security agencies, for people who regulate financial securities, and a local dry cleaning company. But enough of us.
Okay, great. So now we'd like to get to know you a bit. If you would be so kind to type into the chat box your name, your location, your role, and one burning question that you have for us tonight.
We have Alexia, an AppleCare advisor. How is your work-life balance?
That's a great question.
It's much better after retirement.
It's fantastic during sabbatical. No, but jokes aside, I think learning to set boundaries is something that I've grown stronger at as time goes on. And in the early days, it wasn't so great, and I'm doing better at that the further on I move in my career.
Erica in Indiana is a media STEM specialist at an elementary school. And were you always in the ID field?
You want to take a stab at that one, Steve?
Yeah, Nikki's in Detroit and a technical product manager at McGraw Hill. How do you prevent scope creep when identifying root causes and not to escalate such a high level that the remediation is daunting? We want to come back to that one.
Yeah. By the way, I was not always in the ID field. In fact, I didn't know anything about it. I thought I was going to get my PhD in something else.
Yeah. In my undergraduate years, I thought I was going to be a high school debate coach until I was a senior and taking my final education courses and realized I didn't want to be a teacher. And then by accident, I started tutoring in a community college English lab. And that led to a master's degree, and that led to my first ID job. And then I never thought I'd get into performance consulting, but when I started working at DLS Group, my boss was an early adopter of performance improvement, and that's where I started learning about it. But it's always by accident. Nobody grows up thinking, I want to be an instructional designer. Mackenzie is in Indianapolis, a first grade teacher. What's the favorite part of your job? Personally, I like doing things that clients value.
Yeah, I like that, and I like finding patterns.
Allison is in Peoria and an HR manager for a mid-sized nonprofit. When assessing performance, what do you think is the best way to start? How often do you see that clients have misdiagnosed the root of their performance issues? To answer the second question first, always. Usually, most clients in nonprofits and other settings are really bad at diagnosing root causes of performance problems. I start, in my practice, I find the best way to start is where their areas of greatest pain are and what's keeping them up at night. Lisa?
Yeah, I think there is no one size fits all for me. I think every project is different. But the root causes, I find, we do a lot of that work during needs assessment, and a lot of clients have an idea about what's going on, and sometimes there are surprises, but sometimes there are not. They just needed unbiased third party to collect some evidence and facilitate a process for decision makers to interpret the evidence along with you, right? And so we provide that structure. So I think for me, it's been, it's varied.
Gabby is currently located in Phoenix, your old hunting grounds, working as a PD operations specialist at Curriculum Associates. How did you end up where you are today, and what drew you to the ID field? Do you want to answer that?
Sure. I thought I was going to help K-12 teachers integrate technology in the classroom. I always liked playing with computers. I was an early adopter back when there was no graphical user interface and there was black screens and green text on is what you read. So that's kind of how I ended up here. And then what drew me into ID was when I went to go get that PhD to help teachers integrate technology in the classroom, I realized that there was this whole other opportunity to work in organizations, and they would pay you a lot of money to do it. And you draw upon a lot of the same skills, and I found that, honestly, that was really interesting. So I went to go explore, and I loved it.
Yeah, and with me, I'd already done some tutoring and teaching at a community college, and I knew I liked working with adult learners. And I lucked my way into an internship at IBM, and I was IBM's worst intern. But I learned there that I really liked this technical training field, and that got me into ID. And then later, much later, we've been working, and in the early to mid 90s, we started seeing the term knowledge worker appear everywhere. And the traditional ways we had to teach people weren't doing that good a job, because behaviorism doesn't do a great job at teaching people how to solve novel problems in the workplace. And so that's when I decided that a PhD would be a good idea, and that's what took me back to school. And that's what draws me to the field. I'm an expertise junkie, and one of my lifelong interest has been leveraging expertise across the organization. Michaela in Cleveland is a graduate student, middle school special education teacher. What's one of your favorite ID projects you both worked on?
Together or separately? I think.
Well, together is this one.
Right.
What's your separate favorite project?
I guess it was really neat when I got to create training on how to operate a nuclear submarine. I never thought that would fall in my lap.
One of my favorite projects was back when I was consulting, and our company worked with the California Police Officer Standards and Training Office, and our job was to do a cognitive task analysis to represent what detectives do across the state when they conduct criminal investigations. I like working with cops. I'm James McDonald, Associate Producer with Purdue Online Learning. What was it like to work in a dry cleaning business? It's quite a departure from what you'd expect from corporate clients. It really was. And at the end of it, the project ran over budget. And the most interesting thing about the project is that it was a good application for good behavioral principles. You know, here's what stuff should look like as you do it. And then the funny thing is that when the project ran over, they gave the company owner a whole bunch of free dry cleaning for like 5 years, and they called it even. You don't get to do that with big corporate clients. Princess Mandu, graduate student at Purdue, middle school math teacher in Houston. Is there a difference, though, in the work you do in the private sector and government sector contracts in terms of restrictions and/or opportunities? Yeah. The government contracts are, because it's government and people's money, are a little more restrictive than the contracts in the private sector. As a small consulting firm, we had a much easier time negotiating contracts in the private sector than with some of the government clients, because they already knew what they wanted, and they knew if they didn't get it from us, they'd get it from someone else. Lisa, your experience?
There's lots of differences between the private sector and government contracts. In my experience, and it just depends on the context of where you are, but generally the government has it's a slower pace is one of the things that I learned. There's lots of things. Well, we can do a whole webinar on that. Steve, maybe we should try to move this along, although it's really interesting.
Okay.
Yeah, so Scott.
We can circle back to the last two questions from Scott and from Allison.
Yeah, just so we get through the presentation. Scott Anderson, though, it's great to have you here. Welcome. And we'll answer your question later at the end. And then Allison, can you give me an example of a client project that was successful? We'll also, we can talk about that at the end too.
And breakout rooms is possible now. This is Marissa.
Awesome.
Oh, thank you.
Thanks.
Good. When we get to that part, we'll be in your capable hands.
All right. So the two other questions we'll answer for you today is why use the LEAPS model for your HPT work, and how can you start using the model or thinking about using it? Steve, would you like to add anything?
Nope.
All right. Next slide.
Dr. Exeter asked us to start by framing the LEAPS model within the larger field of performance improvement. And she mentioned that that's a high-end technical term. We're using Pershing and Melinda's strategic impact model. And this is a cool model. One of the things that we really like about it is that it's one of the few models that show performance improvement framed by an organization's larger strategic planning, which informs what organizations decide to investigate in a performance analysis. So it's not just somebody wakes up one day and says, I got me a performance gap, I'm going to go solve it. Instead, a wise organization does some strategic planning and realizes that there are opportunities related to some performance gaps, and they conduct a performance analysis. The other thing that Lisa and I like about this model is that performance analysis leads to a cause analysis, and that cause analysis can lead to either instructional or non-instructional interventions. And in our experience, normally it's a little bit of both. And to create, implement, and evaluate those solutions, practitioners tend to use an ADDIE-like approach to manage those solutions. Did you want to add anything, Lisa?
No. Can everybody see the slide deck? Just a question. I see one thumbs up. All right. We will share the slide deck with you all in PDF format as well. Thanks, though, for letting us know, Gabby, that you were having trouble. All right. So the LEAPS model is different from other ID models or frameworks that you've seen. There's a significantly more nuanced and larger picture involved, which is quite more common in HPT models. So the first key points we want to emphasize in the LEAPS ID model are the 3 rings on the outside that contextualize each project. All organizational learning and development, along with professional educational interventions, happen in these complex systems and contexts. So the first ring points to the government, culture, regulations, economic situation, and individual cultures, all of which influence and affect organizational members' choices and actions. So this system encompasses the organizational system and refers to the society and culture in which the organization operates. And sometimes there's more than one of those. There are 2 important points here. Culture has both formal and informal components. The formal components refers to governmental laws, regulations, oversights, agencies, standards, etc., within the region and nation in which the organization operates. The informal component refers to the norms, beliefs, values, practices, languages, etc., within the region and the nation in which the organization operates, and the people that are inside of the organization come from. So individuals are influenced then by multiple, sometimes conflicting cultural systems where from their communities, ethnicities, nationalities, backgrounds, jobs, identities, etc. The second ring points to inclusive design and organizations. So this system encompasses the project management system and refers to the policies, practices, and larger budget considerations, oversight, responsibilities, mechanisms, lines of communication, all of that work in the particular organization. So there are 2 important points with that. The organizational system has both formal, obviously, and informal components as well. And the formal components refer to established, usually written organizational policies and procedures, while the informal components refers to the often unwritten practices and language. So like how people refer to things, acronyms, shorthand expressions that are commonly used in day-to-day operations and interactions. And the individuals within the organization then are influenced by both the organizational system and the particular society and culture in which they live outside of the organization. These multiple systems might conflict with one another as well. So we believe that the inclusive design approaches will contribute to yielding the most organizational justice. The third ring is focused on project management or the practical decisions regarding the process, technology, and relationships that will influence the ID projects. Steve, would you like to add anything?
No, thanks.
All right. So next slide, please. The LEAPS ID model integrates design thinking features which differentiate it from ADDIE-type ISD models. The fact that the empathize and analyze design and development and implement and evaluation components are situated in the 3-ring context also has significant implications for practice. We'll get into more of that later. But here you will also see that these components are overlapped. This is also by intention, and it's significant. We'll talk more about this when we get to scaling. Again, what isn't typical is that all this happens within the context of inclusive design approaches. Remember that second larger ring. So we include many more stakeholders along the way. Steve, would you like to add anything?
No, thanks.
Next slide, please. So what we learn from working through any single activity in our project often informs what we do in future project decisions. This is typical in other ISD and HPT models as well. Again, what isn't typical is that it all happens within the context of inclusive design approaches. Remember that second ring. So we include, again, many more stakeholders all along the way. Steve, you have anything to add?
Yeah, this is just part of a systematic approach to the craft. The activities of one step become an output that becomes an input for the next, and so on. It's a way to eat an elephant one bite at a time.
Awesome. Next slide, please. So LEAPS includes formative evaluation feedback loops for the deliverables produced through the three components, the E and A, D and D, and I and E components is what I'm talking to. This is done to emphasize how feedback loops are utilized by IDs to re-envision, adapt, evolve, iterate, change plans based on new information that becomes available often as project timelines progress. So let's start with the formative evaluations. The purpose of them are to monitor and make improvements to deliverables that have been created throughout the process. The goal is to ensure delivery of culturally relevant and equitable interventions that work for all learners. And we'll talk more about this later on. But the learner's performance in terms of the stated objectives for the L&D program or their organization's performance are in terms of the original problem. Steve, would you like to add anything?
No, that nails it.
Awesome. Next slide, please. So the LEAPS ID model is grounded in heuristics, or the rules of thumb that IDs use to make decisions. These are often learned over time, but we worked hard to make them explicit in the LEAPS ID model. IDs apply heuristics throughout the model, and they are mental shortcuts or reminders that can guide thinking about a topic or problem. The subsequent, you'll learn after you have a chance to read more about the LEAPS model that these heuristics, there's many of them, but some of our favorite are first that ID is a team sport. Another one is IDs work towards the dual requirements of interventions that are both equitable and effective in order to increase performance to the fullest potential possible. They also work towards inclusive design through intentionally expanded collaboration. And again, this is to improve the organization performance as well as individuals' performance. IDs work toward co-production whenever possible. It's not always possible, but there's increasing levels of participation that you can actually advocate for and try out in your projects that yield to more inclusive interventions and equitable interventions. The ID process is dynamic. It changes to meet the changing requirements of any specific project. We've always also been on that project that just evolves as you go forward and change morphs into something different than what you thought about it was at the beginning. We meet schedule and cost. IDs share operating assumptions with the clients. They collect data to either verify or reject these assumptions, and this happens throughout the model in different ways. There's iterations, and the purpose of our activities is to solicit both input and feedback on deliverables that are created as part of the activities that we undertake during each component. So interviews, participatory activities, co-design activities are all common input mechanisms. Client reviews, expert reviews, learner tryouts are also common feedback mechanisms. And any single instructional designer might start and stop their work on a project scope anywhere within the project management ring. So in other words, one ID won't always work through the entire three components of E and A, D and D, and I and E on any single given project, right? I might be doing something with analysis, somebody else might be doing something with design, somebody else might be doing development, but it doesn't mean you're not doing ID. All of these people are doing ID together because, again, we're working as a system. Steve, do you have anything to add?
No.
Next slide, please. And so we didn't quite address these two yellow boxes yet. I'd like to do that next. The LEAPS model actually makes two important assumptions. So both assumptions act as inputs into the model itself. And violating these assumptions altogether can put ID teams and projects at risk. So the first assumption is that an L&D system gap worth closing exists. And the other assumption is that adequate sponsorship exists. So let's talk about the worthy gap and needs assessments first. The LEAPS model doesn't use learning and performance solutions as a panacea for all the organization's problems or opportunities, right? We know that sometimes we can choose non-instructional interventions or systems changes to improve performance. We don't always need to do training. Sometimes people already have the knowledge and skills. So instead, LEAPS assumes that somebody in the organization has already conducted an adequate needs assessment. And this could be anybody. This could be somebody 5 levels above us or next to us, or it could be us. There's a variety of input sources where this needs assessment might come from, but it should it exists to specify a performance gap or discrepancy between the actual system performance and the desired performance. And there's an argument that the gap is worth closing. And we've concluded that the solutions to the root causes of this performance gap include providing adequate guidance, describing how to perform the job or a need for a skill and knowledge development. I think someone might be able to turn off their microphone, mute themselves. In addition, the organization should have used the needs assessment to inform other groups in the organization about any causes of systems gaps that lie outside of the L&D system. So in some cases, other groups in the organization, such as information technology or quality assurance, might address the causes. In other cases, the L&D group might partner with these groups to address these causes. In either situation, though, the L&D group doesn't merely ignore or walk away from the causes of the systems gaps. So if we turn to project sponsorship, we would assume that clients and other organizational stakeholders collaborate with the ID team throughout the ID project. Ideally, this means that clients have ownership. Sorry about that. That clients have ownership and invested interest or skin in the game, right, to meet these sponsorship responsibilities that support the work of their ID teams. So this sort of sponsorship aligns well with professional standards about working in partnership with clients. We've heard that through ISPI, AECT, IBSTIPI, 2012. And these responsibilities include that there's a trustworthy source of organizational intelligence about how the organization works, especially if you're external or even if you're internal at different levels within that organization or different areas within that organization. Because we don't have all access to all levels and all areas, right? And that there's release time for stakeholders to review key deliverables. There's successful performers or subject matter experts to participate in task analyses, that learners and job incumbents participate in reviews and tryouts of the project deliverables, including job aids and development of drafts and intervention materials, that you have access to data sources, that you have, you will get management or supervisor support for skill transfer to the workplace setting after a learning intervention has been implemented, that they're supporting formative and summative evaluation efforts, and they're providing overall project oversight to ensure that the intervention will meet the organization's strategic business objectives and that adequate change management effort will support the adoption of the newer change performances. And this sounds fabulous, right? We'd all love an organization like that and sponsorship like that, but sometimes it's lacking, right? Let's be real. So what do we do if sponsorship is lacking? Well, there are workarounds that we can engage in. We can create topic-based training. You know, if we don't have access to SMEs and participants for interviews, surveys, observations, and formative evaluations, we might create a topic-based training on information that you can find online or from other sources. You know, there's a potential cost to that, but we can do it. We can find substitutes for SMEs and potential learners when SMEs and representative learners are scarce and you don't have access to them. We might find help outside the organization. But over time, we can build sources of organizational intelligence, other ways in the organization, at the water cooler, out to lunch, at networking events. So when we're savvy, we find potential allies and ways to get information about how the organization will work. Steve, would you like to add anything?
No, thank you.
Okay, great. Nikki is yes, I think it's Nikki. Nikki's asking, what does the formative evaluation between empathize and implement and D&D look like? So, excuse me, by the formative evaluation, there's many different ways that would take shape, right? And it's different at different points and different for different projects. But one example of a formative evaluation for empathize and analyze, the E and A component, might be to take existing data sources that you have available and scratch up some personas, and then take that set of personas to your stakeholders and ask them, does this look complete? Are there characteristics within the intended learner population that we've missed? Are there things here that you're not sure that exist in the intended learner population? So getting somebody who's going to be supporting this transfer of performance to the workplace to have a look at what you're doing and just give you some feedback. That's one way to do it, the formative eval. In D&D, depending on what you're working on, if you're scratching up a prototype, you might have somebody who could be a potential learner, do a walkthrough with you on that prototype, and you might watch, like, how do they interact with the prototype? How do they use the prototype? What catches them? If it's on the screen, like, where do their eyes stop? If it's a job aid, like, is it difficult for them to use? Do they miss a step? Things like that, observations, right? Those are ways of doing formative evaluation at different places with different people inside of the model. And of course, there's a lot more that we could go into that. But does that help you get at least a start on wrapping your head around what that might look like? Okay, awesome. Yeah. And then there's a question also, how do you demonstrate the value of the interventions, post-interventions, and how do you basically show the work you did was valuable?
Can I take that one?
Absolutely, Steve.
If you're in a situation where you're able to have a needs assessment that is an input into the ID effort, that's going to tell you that there's a performance gap in the organization, and the performance gap is worth closing. And so part of that performance analysis is going to state what the expected return on investment is going to be. It might even specify not only a return on investment, but a payback period. In informal situations, sometimes just easing organizational pain is enough. So if informally I ask a sponsor, what's keeping you up at night? And they say, well, I can't get my newbies in this organization onboarded fast enough. And when they start working, they make a lot of mistakes. I can start saying, well, if we could cut that by 10%, what would that mean? By 25%, what would that mean? And I can start growing that sense of what the value is at the very beginning of the project, and then come back after the project's done and say, we estimated this and we gave you this. What's important in either one of those approaches, and what is marvelous about your question, Nikki, is that you want to be thinking about how you show the value of what you're doing early before the project even starts. because if you try to do it afterwards, you're on really shaky ground. Did that answer your question?
All right. So right here in front of you, you have the entire LEAPS ID model depicted visually. And of course, what you see here has significant and far-reaching implications for ID and HPT practice. It might look a little complex at first. That's because it is. ID is complex, and we are only starting to talk about that more in the literature, I think, over the last 10 to 15 years. Steve, would you like to add anything? I think you're muted, Steve.
Yes, I are. The only thing I wanted to add was that you could get a PDF file of our slides using this link that now appears in the chat.
Awesome, thanks. So next slide, please. All right, so here's an analogy that might help us better understand how HPT and ID actually play out, right? So the LEAPS model, we like to think of it as similar to a working metropolitan hospital. So a really big one with state-of-the-art systems, right? Both are comprised of systems, sets of interrelated and connected parts working together for a common purpose, but doing different things, right? So as you can see here, a hospital is made up of a number of different departments that are connected with people that have different skills. They're using different tools. They're engaging in ongoing, purposeful, and dynamic interactions, all with one goal, right? Patient health. In the same way, LEAPS model is made up of a number of interconnected components in which people with different skills are using a variety of different tools to engage in ongoing and purposeful dynamic interactions, all with the common goal of improving organizational performance. And note that the goals are slightly different and that the departments and the people and the tools are different, but the essential similarity is that both involve a set of interrelated and connecting parts that work together to achieve that common purpose. So no one person in the hospital will likely take care of all the work required to care for any given patient. Similarly, no one person will likely to be able to complete all the work required to create any given L&D intervention. And you're going to need different perspectives involved in that process, and different cultures and different identities and different work assignments and levels in the organization, and situations in the organization. So in both situations, different people and tools are part of successful interventions and solutions. And the interactions are ongoing, they're dynamic, they're dependent upon the requirements of time, budget, resources, and everyone in the interrelated subsystems have different perspectives, different experiences, identities, expertises, and so on. And these differences, we view them all as assets and strengths in the bigger picture. Steve, would you like to add anything?
No.
Awesome. Next slide, please.
So why use that LEAPS model? Well, one is that a recognition of diversity is good for business and good for society. Josh Burston has published in 2021-2023 a business case, and his conclusion is that the case for diversity and inclusion is proven. Promoting organizational cultures of belonging and equity is the challenge of the decade, and upskilling emergent talent. It's going to be a challenge for HRD leaders. So, Lisa and I looked at this and said, how might L&D leaders work in ways on ID projects that support diversity, equity, and inclusion? In the chat window, I just put in another document that provides more information about this case for diversity, equity, and inclusion that we've applied to ID. So you have some interesting factoids here, but we also included Roger Kaufman's organizational elements model here, simply going back to his contention that the best work that we do is not just helping organizations produce their products and outputs that go to customers outside or inside the organization, but when we create outcomes that strategically benefit society.
Yeah.
And so that's our case for why. In terms of how to use the model, we want to talk about 5 different things. We want to talk about partnerships, inclusive design strategies, performance-based learning and development, scaling, and some real-world heuristics. There's an old adage, what you do working without me, you do to me. Working in partnership with stakeholders in ways that produce results, include a systematic view, add value, have long been part of the performance improvement mandate. Also, this idea of working in partnership. Interestingly, what this partnership means has expanded over the years. In 2003, partnership meant clients and specialists. In 2010, Don Toasty viewed partnership as an arrangement between clients and professionals. Now in 2023, this sense of partnership is even larger, and it includes clients, our teams, and stakeholders across the organization, and people that have traditionally been left out of some of those stakeholder arrangements. So on the left of this slide, we have some of the common suspects that usually get involved in ID projects. Managers, clients, and sponsors, and learners, and SMEs, and lions, and tigers, and bears. Oh my. Who's left out? Would you use your chat box to take a guess at who might not be here? Lisa and I can hum the Jeopardy song, but it probably wouldn't be good. ID isn't included in here, so the ID group isn't here. So the teams who are creating the work for the sponsors and the organization, that's great, Andre. Others? This work is going on inside of organizations. Who else might be affected by the work of IDs in the organization? An ID or on the ID team, yep. And who else in the organization? Customers, bing, 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 bing. Exactly, and those customers could be outside the organization as final customers, or they may be internal customers who receive a output that they use to create something else. Employees, yes, and different types of employees might be affected. And some of them might be employees that are considered upstream. They're people that provide inputs to one group of people, and other stakeholders might be downstream. They're the folks who get the outputs of one group and have to use them to create something else. And all the other people that may have been overlooked for any other reason aren't included here either. And that's why inclusive design matters. I was an ID for a long time, and one of the scariest things you can hear after the project is done, after the schedule is over, after the budget has been spent, the pilot test reveals more things wrong, and the clients are unhappy and saying, that isn't what we wanted. That started happening to programmers before IDs, or at least programmers had more money to fix the problem. And starting in the 1990s, their solution was to expand participation and expand partnership and involve the people who would be using this stuff and the people who would be affected by the software throughout its development, its implementation, and its maintenance. And we draw upon that tradition and talk about different inclusive design strategies. At the base of this period is consultation. We can be inclusive, and every now and then we'll talk to people and see if we are. We can involve some people, but if we're only involving them in a few places and not throughout the process, and we're not doing that much with their involvement, or we're couching their involvement in a lot of ID jargon, then that's problematic. So finally, we get into areas of inclusive design that are a little more involved and a little more inclusive, so to speak. One is the participation and people reviewing things and people being parts of usability tests. And then finally at the top is this idea of co-production, of involving everybody in the co-production of the ID product itself in different ways at different times. If you think about that co-production and participation, those levels, by the time an ID project is done, it should be touching a lot of the people in the organization, and its credits list should look like that at the end of a movie. Lots of people have touched this and bought into it and shaped it in the course of its coming together. And that full participation starts on day one of the project, if not sooner. All these non-usual suspects, all these different stakeholders need to be part of empathize and evaluate and extend throughout the rest of those ID components. And so some of the activities associated with empathize and analyze is reviewing the results of that needs assessment or conducting a quick one as part of this effort to identify a gap that's worth closing, a learner and environmental analysis, a learning requirements analysis to determine what kinds of tasks are involved, how complex they are, what kind of approaches the training might use, empathy mapping to find out where people's pain points and areas of opportunity might be. Other activities might include personas, the use of data to create fictional but representative people who are part of those stakeholders that the training is being created for. Linda, did I miss anything?
No, but what I kind of wanted to share was, I don't know about you guys, but when I was in my early days of ID, I wanted to make sure I did the best job, and running into constraints, that felt uncomfortable for me. We realized that you're not going to be able to get to co-production in every project, but in some projects, it's really important. So for example, if you're doing a project for a community organization, right? They're going to be more open, and you're advocating for more inclusive participation, especially from the people that they want to serve, right? And then maybe you don't get to co-production in every organization. But what I also found working as an ID is that if I had my own personal agenda and I stuck to making points in every meeting regarding different projects and how we could do this better, and after 2 or 3 years, I would hear people say the same things, and then I would see our process change, right? So it's not something that maybe you could do all at once and to the best of the best of the best, but you do your best and you advocate, and slowly over time you get access to what you need to be more inclusive and equitable in your work. All right. And so by including individuals with diverse identities and perspectives, and including learners on your ID team, ideally, or minimally throughout the process at different points, all throughout, you'll arrive at what we term E3+, effective, engaging, and equitable learning experiences that focus on learning by doing. So these always include somehow, some way, guided observation. So showing learners why something is done, what is accomplished, and how it's done, right? Good demonstrations highlight what is critical, what is difficult, and complex. In addition, good demonstrations show how to recognize situations, make decisions, and solve problems. And then often these things can include guided practice when necessary, allowing learners to practice specific processes that accomplish specific results. As things progress, the nature of the tasks might increase in difficulty and complexity or standard performance as necessary. Or if it's really easy, maybe they don't, because everyone gets it all at once, the first time they do it or the second time they do it. Merrill notes that learners should receive real-time coaching, immediate notification of correction of errors and missteps. In addition, learners should also receive delayed feedback after they perform the task. And this kind of post-mortem reflection and feedback loop describes both the extent to which the performance met the workplace standards and how to improve the performance. And sometimes they also need to demonstrate mastery. So for example, in a CPR course, right, you have to show that you can do it properly so that you can, people have confidence in you, that you'll be able to go out there and be an asset in any kind of given emergency and not make things worse. And perform, by demonstration of mastery, meaning perform the task and thereby generate products or services that are needed. And they show clients and organizational stakeholders that in the end, the intervention and learners were able to perform in ways that met strategic goals. So I noticed Nikki asked, I might have missed it, but how do you include customers in a logistically sustainable way? So Nikki, I think that's a great question. And that's like $1 million one. I don't know if there's any one answer to that. It would depend on the situation and the context, I think, for me. Steve, do you have anything to add?
Only that it kind of depends on who or where the customers are. If the customers are internal, it's an easier path to getting their involvement. And it usually means working your way up the food chain to somewhere on the organization where there's the signatory authority to ensure that the internal customers who receive a product or a service are included as stakeholders. If the customers are outside the organization, I think that is a bigger question. And I think that's where things like customer groups, that's where things like beta testing, that's where all these customer loyalty programs and so on come into play. There are lots of different people trying lots of different things because that's a hard one. Everyone knows it's important, but it's also hard to potentially bring them in and have them stay long enough to be able to make a positive contribution. I hope that was an adequate answer.
Awesome. Next slide, please. So scaling the scope is, of course, as well multifaceted. You can scale the process, you can scale iterations, you can scale feedback loops, you can scale performative evaluations, and it can also be a function of the extent to which components overlap. As you see in the middle, they are somewhat overlapped. However, in different scaled projects, they might be looking more like the components you see on the right there with the arrow down the side, where the circles, the E&A, D&D, and I&E are a little bit more separate, like in a huge, large, multi-billion-dollar government DoD implementation. It's going to look a little bit more like that. However, in a really small implementation, perhaps you're making a job aid so someone can use a library, and you know how, and you are the SME, right? As well as the ID. Maybe you're the component, the E&A, I&E, and D&D are a little bit more overlapped. You might be kind of gathering all this information at once and developing it at once and implementing it and prototyping it and testing it all at once, right? You don't need, so it's very, very iterative and fast-paced and super short and sweet. And then in the middle, you know, it might overlap to more or less extent, depending on the project needs. We're almost out of time. So I think we'll skip forward to the next slide, please. Another way to scale projects is to consider different micro interventions, right? So the combination and types of interventions, it's a lot easier to provide a couple of job aids if that will close the performance gap rather than, you know, half-day training or multi-day training or online course modules, right? If you could just put the job aid right where the person needs it to do the job or to be able to make the decision or complete the task. That's, you know, short and sweet. Let's forward to the next slide, just in the interest of time. And of course, all of these considerations fit into the larger picture of the learning ecosystem. So like what needs to happen within the organization, right? And so what you see on this slide is an example of a logic model that you can build to help you determine what you need to implement, what kinds of interventions you need to implement in order to get access to the short-term, midterm, and long-term outcomes. So you can draw lines through each one of these things. You can make substitutions. If we're starting to get into, you know, AI and recommender systems or outside components, right? External vendor offers or communities of practice and things like that. They can even fit into your ecosystem as well. We don't have to develop everything ourselves, as we all know. Steve, do you have anything to add on those 3 slides at all?
No.
All right, so let's go to the next slide.
I think I'd rather, in the interest of time, we're not going to have time for the breakout. So in the remaining 30 seconds, we're happy to continue with anyone who'd like to stay talking with us and answer your questions or talk about this stuff. But we'd also like to thank you for your time and your interest in our work.
Yeah. Can you show the last slide, please? That way people can connect it with us. If you can't stay for a little chat or we all have to go, you can connect with us on LinkedIn and we can continue this online or at another time. Or AECT if anyone's going to AECT. So thank you so much for coming, and we'll open it up to questions and discussion. Unless we need to close it all down, which is okay too.
It's fine to stay open as long as you would like to, but just recognizing that some people will be leaving.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's 9:30 back east.
You're welcome, Nikki. You're welcome, James. Oh, and to circle back to the 2 questions we got at the beginning, we could do that. Let's see, we're the last 2. So Scott Anderson asked, where do you see the future of HPT and ID? And do you see corporations merging their HR departments with ID? So I think ID and HPT will get more and more performance-based, especially in organizations. It's a dirty secret that L&D industry spends millions of dollars a year and doesn't change the dial too often. And I think that's because there's been a lot of focus on building content that covers ideas and concepts versus how to make decisions. So we're interested in pushing the field towards looking at how do you make decisions. So not what is a conflict of interest? Of course, we all have to know how to define the term and the concept, recognize yes and no's. But then what are examples of decisions that the organization knows people have to make that could be conflicts of interest, right? And to make sure that we're training to decision-making capacity. That's one place. And then HR merging with ID, I think that'll be more of a case by case basis. What do you think, Steve?
In my experience, organizations are handling this differently. So in some organizations, you'll see HR appearing on the org chart, and the training group is buried so deep somewhere that, you know, it's not on the major organization org chart at all. I do pro bono consulting work with another nonprofit that decided that they wanted to implement the position of a chief people officer with the idea of merging the traditional HR and performance improvement functions. And so, you know, we're talking about a range that's just huge of HR may not exist that much. They're not in the executive suite. We've integrated the HR and we've integrated the performance improvement. I think over time, Lisa's argument bears scrutiny, and I think you'll see more organizations kind of merging these things and expecting results out of their investments.
Yeah, more and more MBAs out there.
And we also had Allison who asked about an example of a successful client project and the process we went through, and a project that wasn't as successful, and why. Do you want me to start on that one, or do you want to?
Sure.
The work we do in the process management lab is rigged because my co-investigators and I are all retired, and we do this because we like working with graduate students and graduates, and we do this because we like helping nonprofits help our community. And so that process works really well, and the reason it works well is for two reasons. One, we're pretty good at process improvement. But the other part of that secret sauce is that we won't do any work unless we know we have adequate sponsorship. We can walk away. We're not getting paid or paid all that well for this stuff. So if an organization is thinking that, you know, we're going to be a magic panacea and all we need to do is have a workshop and all their problems will be solved, that's not going to work well. And so projects that haven't worked well, and why, whether they're process improvement or ID projects, the ones that have not worked is when we had real problems with sponsorship. You know, we didn't have a sponsor with skin in the game. We didn't have a sponsor who was going to get us the resources that they had previously agreed to get us. We had a sponsor, I'm thinking of one particular sponsor on all this, who constantly changed their mind and then wondered why we reflected their request in change orders for additional time and materials on the contract. You know, I think the stuff we do as IDs and working amongst ourselves and working with other people is fairly straightforward. I think the sponsorship nut is the hard nut to crack. And life without sponsorship is always harder than life with it. Lisa?
Yeah. I think, so as a ID, I guess the unsuccessful projects were the ones that we didn't get a chance to finish. And we didn't get a chance to finish them for lots of different reasons. Different projects had different reasons, but mostly a lack of sponsorship in those situations. I think people realize like how much work they're going to have to put in, right? And they really just wanted a slide deck. That's what they wanted. And we didn't want to give it to them because we knew that we couldn't guarantee delivery of results, right? So then we weren't able to get everybody's values on the same page, and the project ended. The projects that have been successful, process changes between each and every one, depending on the context. That's what we're arguing for, or going to argue for in the book, is really a highly contextualized process based on the needs of the specific situation and organization and the learners involved. Because I mean, some training you can buy off the shelf and you're good to go. I remember when I first got to Boise State, I took an e-learning on an active shooter situation. I will never forget that e-learning. Right? What is it? It was run, hide, fight. Right? I'll never forget that. I'm prepared. I can go into any active shooter situation in any organization, and I know how to handle myself there. But most decisions that we have to make about our jobs and just general day-to-day fashions, you know, buying off-the-shelf training doesn't really solve the issue. And I think that's because most of the training is at a very high level. It's concepts like open the sales with the greeting, you know, and then, you know, get the customer hooked, find their problem. You know, and we can listen to these very high level trainings and participate in them. But if we don't get practice, like making those decisions ourselves in a very applied context, and messy situation with, you know, nuances, it doesn't really do the trick. I have seen an example of a software that's under development, that's a virtual environment where they can, it looks like a Zoom call or like a Teams call, and you have to interact with different people who are asking questions based on different contexts, right? And so you're kind of put in the hot seat, like it's that embodied experience. And maybe we'll get more to those type situations. But again, those are highly contextualized examples of where you have to make decisions on the spot in order to achieve the desired performance output, right? So that kind of stuff, if it becomes available and when it becomes available, might be a little bit, you know, more off-the-shelf solutions could potentially change performance. But I think that will be a function of the way that the training is implemented, right? That embodied experience versus the slide deck of concepts. Does that make sense?
And Scott Anderson asked, what are some of the potential barriers when using the LEAPS model in K-12 education?
Princess Madhu.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I'm still getting used to the interface. That's a really good question. One of the barriers we've talked about is sponsorship. In a K-12 setting, you know, you've got a complex system of administrators, principals, teachers, parents, students, and getting all of them together in terms of a way that produces co-designs, I think will be a challenge. I think the other potential barrier is that in educational settings, the solution for every problem is to educate people. And I think helping people grow skills and build knowledge can be really helpful in certain situations. But getting back to that performance technology, that performance improvement model, there are lots of other things that may be at the root of a performance gap. And I think getting permission and awareness that those things could be at play are difficult. Fortunately, there are two good sources on that, and I'm putting them in the chat window. Books by Judy Hale and Deb Page, a field guide for doing performance improvement in the schools, and Joe Harless wrote a book called The Eden Conspiracy, which was his take on applying HPT to the public school system.
Thank you so much for that.
Oh.
The looks like Scott asked, how much time do you spend gaining buy-in versus implementing changes? Well, that's a good question. Probably try to get buy-in the whole project through.
Yeah, I think you're looking at building buy-in throughout a whole project. So yeah, you've got to get enough at the beginning to get the necessary permissions, the contract signed, the release time allocated, the schedule put in place, and so on. But if you're doing, if you're working in partnership, you really want to be growing buy-in all the way through. So as you bring in people from the stakeholders to come in and review things, that's an opportunity for buy-in. When you bring them in and ask them to test things, that's an opportunity for buy-in. When you address their concerns about changes that are going to happen, that's buy-in. So I think it's not an either or. I think in this game, especially when you're dealing with the things that LEAPS produces, which is skills that people can apply in different settings, you're messing with the jobs people have and what they do in organizations. And that's always about buy-in. And so you're always spending time on buy-in.
Thank you, though. Great questions.
Yeah, really good questions. Thank you all. And asking them at this hour of the night on Eastern time zones.
Thank you so much for joining us. This has been really great.
Oh, thank you.
You're welcome. Our pleasure. Yeah, we're happy to come anytime.
I might take you up on that.
Yeah, we'd be happy to come back. So
yeah, and talk about components or pieces or projects, you know, also.
Great. I'll contact you in a year or two then.
We love Zoom. We love the video conference thing, how you can talk to people anywhere, anytime.
Yeah.
And we hope that everyone connects with us on LinkedIn, because we'd love to learn and grow with you guys too.
Oh, that's a great point. If you want to send me the information, I can pass it on to the instructors to.
We provided a copy of the PDF copy of the slides, and they're the last slide there. And here's the link to the PDF file. And I can also give you my LinkedIn. I just need to play on my computer first.
I posted the link, Steve, for us.
Okay, thank you. Anything else?
Thanks, Princess Madhu.
Oh, thank you.
All right, I'll stop the recording. Or Irina, can you stop the recording, please?
Yes, thank you so much. Exciting.
Thank you all.